Weatherly. Mark Weatherly, can you introduce yourself, please?
Mark, you're on mute.
Okay, we'll get this technical stuff.
Sorry, came over from the Congressional Budget Office to OMB. Early in my career at CBO, I've been working on the budget side of CBO and doing various federal financing issues. And I got hired into the OMB agriculture branch to do all of the Department of Agriculture's loan programs, including farm loans and rural development loans and housing loans. So I was a program examiner there in that branch for, I don't know, 8 years or so, and then became the branch chief for the agriculture branch. And then I made a number of moves and got around to almost all the domestic discretionary agencies. Became the deputy associate director, or the DAD, for energy, science, and water, so which was the Department of Energy and NASA and NSF and the Corps of Engineers and TVA, among other programs. And then the last decade I was at OMB, I got the job that I wanted when I came out of grad school, which was the DAD for Housing, Treasury, and Commerce. So I had departments of those three cabinet agencies, as well as SBA, Postal Service, federal financial regulators, that kind of thing. So spent a good long while and saw a number of different programs on the budget side of OMB.
Well, thank you, Mark. So next slide.
How about Kathy?
I'm not sure she's joined us yet. Kathy, are you here?
Dang.
So if she joins us, we'll bring her in.
I emailed her and I'll see if I can get her.
Okay, no worries. So I just want to start with a little background, our discussion of OMB. And let's go back to the very, very beginning of OMB. Now, OMB was created, then the Bureau of the Budget, in the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. And President Harding selected Clarence G. Dawes to be the first director of the Bureau of Budget. Now, he was a lawyer. Then he became a gas plant executive, and natural gas was a big deal back in the 19th century. He was controller of the currency in 1897, and then went back in 1901 and became a bank executive. But his claim to fame was that he was the chief logistician of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. He was General Pershing's logistics officer, and this brought him to some prominence. So in 1921, President Harding appointed him to be the first director of the Bureau of Budget. Now, he was a business executive, and his purpose under Harding was to bring business principles to the government. That was his core belief. And later on, just as a side note, he became vice president of the United States under President Calvin Coolidge. So it's kind of a next slide. It's kind of an interesting story how the Bureau of Budget got started. What Clarence Dawes did is he had a kickoff meeting, you know, like we have kickoff meetings today, and they gathered the 500 most senior officials in the government into an auditorium, and they invited the President of the United States to give remarks. So President Harding gave some remarks to the 500 people, and then Clarence Dawes articulated the principles of the Bureau of the Budget. And I'd like to just take a quick minute to review these principles that were the original founding principles of the Bureau of the Budget, which later became OMB. And the first thing he says is the Budget Bureau must be impartial, impersonal, non-political. That's the key founding principle according to Clarence Dawes. And then he said the director of budget should have no responsibility under the law save the Bureau of the Budget. So you shouldn't be doing extra duties. That the director should be an advisor to the president and focused on business administration. The idea of the Bureau of Budget was to make the government not just have a budget, but to be efficient in its operations. Then the third principle is that the Bureau of the Budget acts for the president and therefore should have access to all the information it requires in the government. And then the fourth idea is that at every department, there would be a budget officer who would connect directly with the Bureau of the Budget. So these are the core founding principles. And I was just our first to kick off this discussion by asking Courtney and Mark to comment on these principles and to what extent are they still in force? How have they served the OMB over the years? Courtney, you want to go first?
Sure. For the entirety of my career at OMB, OMB really takes the principles seriously that the analysis has to be impartial. The goal is to provide information for decision makers, for the policy officials who have to make those decisions and take responsibility ultimately for those decisions. I really want to say that the OMB staff really believe in that. And there are always, lots of decisions that have to be made. Some of them are more challenging than others, but the goal for the OMB staff is to provide all of the information and let the policy officials make the political and policy decisions. Mark, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Thanks, Courtney. I think the first criteria, impartial, impersonal, and non-political, I think is the key one, and is under a microscope today, of course, with the new administration coming in and some of their moves. And I think there's general agreement, even with the incoming administration, that has to be uppermost. They must be impartial, impersonal, non-political. Even though this Schedule F, as I'm sure most of you have heard about, proposal is back on the table to change some of the career protections for an awful lot of budget analysts, including some estimated 80–90% of OMB folks. I think we can get into that in a little bit further, but I think that is the key one. One of the other characteristics I think that come out in this that Andy mentioned is the need to be somewhat detached from operational aspects of running the government. OMB was not set up or intended to run programs. Nevertheless, there have been occasions in its history when it has done that, not very well from my point of view. For instance, OMB was made a board member for a new first responders interconnectability agency, and that was kind of excruciating. I think it's important that they have to remain objective and detached from program operations so that they can analyze it and make recommendations to the politicals.
Okay.
Could I make a point? Hello?
Yeah, hi, is this Kathy?
Yes, I don't know. I'm on my screen, I'm called Andy Prayboard. So I'm not sure you're seeing me.
We fixed that, Kathy. You're now Kathy.
Okay, thank you. I guess I would point out that OMB is a dynamic place over time, and your description up front, based on those principles from Dawes, is still accurate, except I would argue that various functions have been added to OMB over time that I'm going to call generally management functions, overseeing whether it's a financial management system, whether it's examining how well programs are working, whether it's coming up with better program metrics, whether it's coordinating disaster response among agencies, especially cross-cutting kinds of things where agencies need perhaps some help from a central place to make sure that there's better response, especially on things like disasters. And these functions have, in my view, grown over time. And the tensions I think that they have placed on OMB staff is that probably you might say it's not popular to say it, there's not enough staff to carry out all of the management and the budget functions as well as we might. And so we have, through various organizational changes, expanded the functions of what budget analysts do. And they work more closely with some of the quote unquote purely management parts of OMB. So my only point, and of course I haven't even talked about all the regulatory oversight that goes on at OMB. So I think one of the tensions we may have now in this institution over the last few years, as opposed to the very beginning, is that we've been asked to do a lot more than we used to do when we were purely the budget office. Our name has changed, and that crosses most administrations, whether Democratic or Republican.
Kathy, would you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kathy Peroff, and I was at OMB for a long period of time, although before that I was in academia, worked at Department of Housing and Urban Development for a few years. And like Courtney and Mark, I have, or when at OMB, I worked in various places, mostly on the domestic side, but then in the last, I can't remember the exact number of years, let's say a dozen years, I worked on the national security side, which I have to say was a major change culturally for me, because I became much more aware of how different in some respects the budget processes are for the Department of Defense versus all of the other agencies. I won't go into all that. Like Mark, I dealt with an energy and science agencies and the cultural agencies, housing, commerce, in the earlier part of my career. One thing I will say about being at OMB is you can certainly get a very in-depth view of all of the things that government does, even though it's from a high level perspective.
Well, thank you and welcome, and thank you for joining us. So as we go forward, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll try to get them as I moderate this. What we're going to do is kind of walk through the OMB's role in the federal government and the budget process. And we'll start with, if you can bring back the slides, the next question is, and maybe Kathy, you can start, what do you think of as the role of OMB in the budget process? Just the budget process. I know they do a lot of other things, but let's focus on the budget process.
Well, I think it's a multifaceted role. You, as an institution, are with input, obviously, from the White House, giving a signal to the departments what their resource allocation is going to be as they plan for their budget. And you send out guidance, and then within that, those agencies will put together their budget requests. That sounds fairly simple, and in one level it is, but particularly when you're talking about the defense versus non-defense shares of the budget pie, that's a very significant policy, political question that has to be resolved early on so that the agencies can begin to prepare. The examiners play a very critical role then in evaluating, having hearings, understanding, learning all about their programs that they're overseeing, and every single federal program has a budget examiner, or who's the new name for them is resource management analyst, responsible for them. So you have a tremendous amount of in-depth knowledge about all government programs that comes into play as those agents, those analysts review the requests that will come in from the agencies, usually sometime in the fall, I'll talk about defense a little later. It doesn't ever really make an official request to OMB. And then after the review of that process, that request, sometime in early December, late November, you send back what is called a passback. That is, it's sort of like a love note to the agencies that says, got your request, we've reviewed it, and here are our thoughts about it. This, we think you've asked for too much in this area. In some cases, we might even say maybe not enough. It depends, especially if it's a priority of the White House. And they then get that document, which can range from 2 pages to 100 pages in length, and they review it, and they will then either accept it. Usually that's not the case. They will appeal either the entire amount. You haven't given us enough money, and the reason why we need more money is X. Those issues are resolved usually in December, and at the end of that, there a final negotiation between OMB and the agencies. The big issues are sometimes not resolved in that negotiation between OMB. That was often the case in the Department of Defense. Those issues get taken up very often to the president or the chief of staff in the White House. And so it becomes a negotiation. It will vary depending on the administration, how that works, where the final decisions are made within the White House or with OMB often at the table to decide on the final amount that they get in any particular programs, and where there's some issues about funding levels. Increasingly, those passbacks also had comments about management priorities of the administration. And sometimes those were, took up a lot of the content that went back, telling, especially as a lot of administrations had cross-cutting management priorities that they wanted the agencies to implement.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to add to what's your view of the role OMB should play in the budget process?
Yeah, I think they need to play an awful lot of what they have been doing in the recent past, which is it's the one place in government where not only all these budget ideas come together, but management ideas, ideas for efficiency gains come together and get worked over. Someone needs to tell the emperor when he has no clothes as far as policy proposals, and that's one of OMB's jobs. Oftentimes it can be more difficult in the agencies to leaven what comes over to OMB as a request, because that request from the agencies is a political document. But someone needs to be able to have the expertise to read those proposals and have a sort of 360-degree understanding of each of these federal programs, which is something that I think as supervisors we've impressed upon our staff often, is that in my view, they need to wake up in the morning thinking they are the world's expert in this particular program. There is no one else who understands the context of the program operations, what's working and what's not working in the delivery of service through that program, and also understand the political context on the Hill. How is this proposal likely to be received? Where are the supporters? Where are the detractors? So that begins to slide into a controversial area of the extent to which OMB career folks need to understand political aspects of the program. To me, it's unavoidable, and it's a service to their political bosses when those examiners at OMB can inform their politicals of that entire context. So that, I think, is a crucially important service that OMB staff provide.
Courtney, thank you, Mark.
I'm not sure that I have a whole lot to add because Kathy and Mark really laid everything out very well. But in terms of the political, I mean, it's I spent most of my time at OMB in the budget review division, and I think it is worth saying that most of the people in the budget review division largely ignored the political, the political stuff. So I had a little bit of a different angle on it. The programs that I worked on and the work that I did in the budget review division gave me a lot of gave me a lot of time with both the examiners, the program examiners, and agency staff, because there were a few things that I specialized in, and many of these things weren't very well understood. And so I brought to this the combination of the political and all of the weird technical stuff, all of the weird technical budget stuff that comes up. And being able to do that, understanding the context and thinking about, okay, what's different in this program from this other program that I work on, and how can I present these programs in a way where it's sort of on a common on a common basis, because you're constantly figuring out, both at OMB and at agencies, what the trade-offs are between options, right? Program options. And politicals are always looking for, how can we actually make this happen? So you have to, there are a lot of moving parts that budget analysts, across the government have to look at and consider. So that you can fully inform the policy officials, whether it's at your agency or at OMB.
One other thing, Annie, just want to emphasize that a role that Kathy pointed out is sort of more recent, which is its management responsibilities. To me, that is really crucial, that somewhere the management proposals and the budget proposals have to come together. It is difficult, as Kathy said, it's an extraordinary workload, and OMB is notoriously paper thin as far as its staffing level. Having 6 or 7 people understand an entire agency. But when there is a good management idea, or when there's a bad one, working it into the budget, making enough room for it, informing the political bosses what those trade-offs are. Yes, you can add 100 million to this new program, but you have to get it out of somewhere. Here are some ideas. So to me, the bringing together of better management and linking it with the budget is increasingly important, I think.
I can
Okay.
just to add to that point, Mark. I can remember, and I think both of you were there at the same time, when we had a management initiative called PART, P-A-R-T, Program Assessment Rating Tool, during the second Bush administration. And the goal was to do a program assessment of every single federal program. And the agencies were to do it using a methodology that OMB developed, and it was a very good effort. It got a lot of kudos from places like the Harvard Management School, but the difficulty of implementing that at the OMB level and working with the agencies, it was a very interesting experience. A lot of the agencies, particularly the one I was dealing with, DOD, they really detested it. They didn't feel that this is the right way to go. They knew what they were doing. They did their own program reviews. They didn't have those kind of metrics. They didn't want to do the kinds of metrics that we were talking about. So it became a huge time sink, I'll call it, and it was a good effort, and I think it was worth it in some respects, but it overwhelmed OMB staff at the time, and then the next administration came in, and it was a completely different set of management initiatives. So we dropped that and moved on to the next, which is typical when you're a staff member at OMB. I mean, you just see each administration has a different notion of what is important and what is the best way to manage, and you have to, how should I say, be flexible.
Yeah, well, thank you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to a discussion of the structure of OMB. And after that, we're going to answer Mike's question, which is in the chat. And then to Karen, I will say, I'm going to post the slides in the AABPA LinkedIn page. So if you're a member of LinkedIn, go to that page and they'll be there. And I'll also just put my email in the chat, and if you need me, if you want to just email me, I'll send it, I'll respond with the slides. So next slide. So let's just talk briefly about the structure of OMB, and I hope this slide is accurate, and tell me if it's not, but could you just kind of walk through the different piece parts of OMB? Do you want to start, Kathy or Mark, who just kind of talk us through this?
Okay. Maybe I'll start just talking about the resource management offices, that bottom tier, and allow Mark or Courtney to move on up. Those five resource management offices oversee all of the federal government. And as you can see, they're defined by functions, as we call them, budget management functions of the government. And in the past, at least, you would have what we call the program associate director. That would be a political appointee overseeing each of those. And on the career side, you would have what we call a deputy associate director reporting to that program associate director. Too many acronyms here. But you would have political, and below the political, the career, the senior budget career official in that area. Whether that will remain in the Trump administration, it's hard to tell. There's some rumors about increasing the number of politicals. So it is possible that you'll have more political control over those offices, to be seen. But each of those offices has a coterie of resource management analysts, and they're the ones that are looking at all the programs and also doing the management issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the national security programs, where I was for a long time. And there I was the senior career official, and we would be dealing with the Department of Defense on an almost daily basis, a lot of interactions going on with the budget offices, with the heads of programs, with all of the intel agencies, of which there are whatever 14 or so, with the defense part of the Department of Energy, which is responsible for nuclear weapons production and oversight, for Department of Veterans Affairs as well. It's not technically a national security agency, but it's clearly an agency that's very integrated into the national security mission of our country. So these are the agencies that are, sort of the pointy end of the spear, so to speak. They're on a daily basis interacting with the rest of the federal government. Examiners are going out to meetings, they're going out and doing field trips. At least in my personal experience, those travel experiences were extremely useful to my learning and on my examiner's learning. And these are the ones that will come up with the initial recommendations for the funding that goes to these agencies and each of these resource management offices. And they give those recommendations to their political person first, that's the program associate director, and then in the important directors review meetings that are held each year as we put together the pass back in the fall. Courtney or Mark, do you want to go on from there to the other parts of OMB?
Mark, you should go before I talk about the nerd stuff. So,
Okay, I'll do the statutory offices there, that box on the top right, which includes, these are more the M side of OMB. One of the key ones and the largest of those statutory offices is the last one, the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, where every regulation that the government comes out with also has to go through OMB and is reviewed by those staff at OIRA, who also do paperwork approvals for those of you in the agencies who are trying to get a form approved. But again, those regulations, each of the program examiners down in the resource management offices are also supposed to have read those regulations, so they understand the current policy and how that is changing. But there's also, as you can see, that financial management, procurement policy, how the government contracts out and acquires and pays its bills with the private sector, and the Office of eGov and IT, which is interesting because that sort of dovetails a little bit with, some of you have heard about this new DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, that's being established within the Office of the President. Apparently in that executive order that the president signed a couple of days ago, it was created out of the digital service. They basically renamed the U.S. Digital Service, which originally started as a little office within OMB. They renamed the digital service as the DOGE. So that emphasis on IT and agency systems obviously just continues to grow as technology does. And that office and those offices within that, it's going to be interesting to see how they interact with the DOGE and other offices. So those are statutory offices. Courtney, maybe you want to take the OMB wide or the weird
sure.
stuff?
Oh, I thought that the OMB wide offices were the weird stuff. That's what people told us anyway. So the OMB wide offices, those offices are really, the folks who work in those offices are really experts in particular ways of getting things done. So for example, the Budget Review Division works all across OMB to provide guidance to examiners and to agencies on following rules and laws, and it plays a very big role in actually bringing the budget together and issuing it every year, which is a huge, when you think about all of the agencies putting their budget data into the system, into OMB's system, and the OMB examiners and policy analysts reviewing it and helping the agencies get their numbers in so that when the president issues the budget, the data is, has been scrubbed. It's been, all the numbers add up. And the very sizable number of documents actually gets delivered to Congress so that Congress can, at least in theory, consider the president's request. So the Budget Review Division is it helps both agency staff and OMB staff to understand the rules and to make sure that the numbers all conform and add up. There are several other offices in OMB. For example, economic policy. There's a group that works with the White House to develop the economic assumptions for the president. And the economic assumptions will assume that the president's policies in the budget will be enacted. So it's actually kind of, I think it's an interesting thing where, okay, yes, of course, you're hoping that the entirety of the budget gets enacted if you're the president. But that never happens in reality, obviously. But the assumption is, here are calculations of different economic factors and how those will affect the spending and collections going far into the future. Legislative reference in OMB. OMB is also responsible for making sure that agencies, so for proposed legislation or other policies, OMB is responsible for making sure that all agencies have had a chance to weigh in on those proposed policies, legislation, blah, blah, blah. So the Legislative Reference Division of OMB makes sure that happens. And of course, OMB has a general counsel and a personnel office. But I mean, those are it's less about a particular program and more about the broader, the broader scenarios for the OMB wide offices.
Okay, thank you, Courtney and everyone.
Sorry, Andy.
Oh, wait.
It's important just to give folks, I think, a little idea of the numbers we're talking about. I think roughly, maybe it's safe to say, OMB has maybe 500 people, of which half of them are in the resource management offices at the bottom there. Of those, and it has maybe, in most years, it has had roughly, I don't know, what, 12 to 16 politicals, and the rest career. And that is something that, as Kathy mentioned, I think the number of politicals in the Trump administration within OMB is going to grow. I think it has to grow, in part because the PADs, the politicals, are being asked to take on more work, I think, than they did, in particular, signing of apportionments. Mm-hmm. We can stray into the fun controversy the last time and the Impoundment Act, but when apportionments, which allocate money that Congress has appropriated, are given to the agencies, the idea is that they have to provide the amount of money that Congress has appropriated. And if there's an apportionment that withholds that money, as they're talking about, in some cases where the administration, the politicals disagree with it, it's the PADs who are going to have to sign those apportionments, not the career people, I would argue, because that's legally entering a gray area, let's say. So currently, as I say, maybe it's extremely thin, the number of politicals, but I think it's going to grow, and given the job descriptions for OMB, I think it has to grow.
Okay, so Andy, you can stop showing the screen now. The presentation will just work with questions from here out. Mike Aller had a question a while ago, and it's a long one, so I'm going to read it slowly. How can the budget management process within the federal government be improved from a strategic and structural perspective? And I'll just stop there and let you address that question, and then we'll come to the other parts of the question. So how would you improve the federal budget process? And he does mention things like multi-year budgets, dynamic scoring, review processes, reauthorization of mandatory spending, and a couple other proposals.
I'll just throw one out. I think OMB examiners and OMB in general, different parts of OMB, need to work more often with agencies. Too often OMB turns into a black hole when an agency sends its budget request over in September, and then they don't hear squat until Thanksgiving. In the interim and throughout the year, I think it's going to be more important that the agency budget offices and OMB and agency program administrators work more closely together, so that there are not as many surprises.
If I may add to that, since I worked with the Department of Defense, where we did have a different type of budget process, very similar to what Mark is talking about. I agree that the notion of a joint review that begins, well, whenever, in the summer of the year before it's submitted or in the early fall, there's some real merit to that. In the Department of Defense, this notion has been around for some time, actually going back to 1947 when the department was created. And they, at that time, asked OMB for help in putting together their budget. And that led ultimately to this notion of a joint review, which is the nature of which is varied over time, but it's still in play. And there's much benefit to OMB and agency staff sitting at the table together when they're putting together their request. It doesn't mean that there isn't, OMB staff are not always going to agree with the agency or vice versa, but at least that discussion is very much out in the open early on. So as you move towards the time of a quote unquote OMB passback in the fall, OMB staff have a very good idea of why the agency is doing what it's doing and where they're coming from. And of course, then the passback occurs and there's going to be further negotiation on that. But I have to say, having been on the domestic side, I wasn't very keen on the notion of the DoD process at first, in part because I didn't feel there was as much sharing as I thought there should be. But that over time, I became convinced that there was more benefit than not. So I agree with Mark on that one. The other idea I would have, but it won't go anywhere, which is maybe a budget process every 2 years rather than every year to reduce the amount of budget churn that we have that just takes up so much time. And I don't know if the value is there, but that's my personal opinion. I think the appropriators, the budget committees probably would not like that, particularly the appropriators, because well, there are some arguments against it. There are things that are changing, you know, within that interim period, and they believe they need to be able to mark up an appropriation to reflect that. I think there are ways of getting around that, but it's been discussed, but it's never really come to fruition. I think that's something that I would like to see. And then thirdly, I guess this isn't a structural change so much as, having worked at OMB a long time, I guess I would just say that over time, it seems that the number of things, and this is in line with the growth of management and other functions, the number of things that examiners were being asked to do had just increased exponentially. And at times we would have reviews to go over all of those things, and the examiners often had some very good suggestions for reducing the lower priority activities so that they could focus more on what they felt were the important analytic or longer term analytic issues, program management issues, budget issues. It didn't really happen, you know, and there are reasons for that. I can just tell you, when I was in the department or dealing with defense issues, at my level, so much of the time was often focused on responding to questions coming from Congress and letters that had to be put together. It took up an enormous amount of time, or questions coming in from the press. The White House realizes pretty soon when they come into power that OMB staff know a lot and that they know how to respond quickly, probably, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on agencies, but faster than agencies. And so a lot of times, especially when issues are hot and it's a 24-hour process, 24-hour White House process, when questions come in from the press, they want to know the answer. The White House wants to know the answer or have a response immediately to shut down a bad story or to at least be able to respond to a story. And so we became much more involved in that than we had, I think, in the past. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is what has happened. Again, that kind of correspondence function, the response to the press queries, it cuts into some of the other activities. So the immediate overtakes the longer term. And so I would say it would be nice to have a fresh review of how OMB staff are spending their time and on what functions.
Okay. Let's just talk a little bit about guidance, because that's what's going on right now. We have a new administration and they're sending their guidance out to the agencies for a kind of rapid budget formulation, because the Trump administration is going to try to will produce a budget by, I don't know, March, April, May. So how do they get guidance out, and what kind of things have you seen in the past for budget guidance? Courtney, you want to start off?
I think probably Mark and Kathy would have better stories than I do. For us in the budget review division, we were giving out the very high level guidance, and then the RMOs had to translate that into everything to communicate to the agencies. So Kathy and Mark, I think I'll hand this one off to you.
I'll just mention a couple examples. So the first Trump budget that is going to be put together, which as Andy mentioned, probably come out in March or April, will be very different than the normal budget process that OMB has with agencies, where there's the agency submits in September and the OMB pass back in Thanksgiving. In these first budgets, they are usually tightly controlled by the White House and OMB. So agencies may not even get much of a chance to opine on that budget. There have been budget documents that have come out within a couple months, say, of a new president being sworn in, that they turn to the OMB staff to at least put numbers of what the deficit effect is and how much budget authority we're talking about for each of these new programs. So it could be extremely frustrating from the agency point of view that this first budget may be tightly controlled. You may get a chance to opine on it. Some administrations have given agencies a week to take a look at it. Some of it depends on the clout of the transition teams that are in the agencies, because those are the ones who will have the immediate link to the White House, and agencies may have to use those people to get views of the incoming secretaries or the incoming politicals at the agencies across, so that they can have some kind of input. But chances are there won't be much agency input for the first budget, and then hopefully regular order will get reestablished to put together the budget process in the fall.
So Kathy, what does that regular order look like?
In the case of defense, usually OMB will send what we call guidance, or sometimes it's simply communicated orally. In the spring, summer, it will vary to the department. It's a top level number, and then they begin to pull together their budget within that. And usually when they come back to us, it will be more than what we've given them, and that's what is ultimately resolved in the late fall. I agree with Mark that as with any new administration, things in that first budget are going to be very much tied to what the new president, in this case, President Trump, has said about, in my case, defense. We've heard some things that, he wants probably to amplify defense spending. If we got $850 billion for defense for the last year from Congress, it looks like it's going to be around that much. My guess is that whatever guidance we'll be going over will be at least that and probably more. There's rumors that it might go up to $1 trillion over the next few years. On the other hand, you've heard, or I've heard, we've all probably heard in the papers, some comments by like those that maybe there are some areas where they can cut programs in the Department of Defense, put more emphasis on highly innovative, high-tech programs such as AI. That's the darling program right now. And so some of that money will go to there, but there might be some areas where they'll want to cut. I just think that the total top line will be on an upward trend. And, you know, it seems like ancient history, but I guess since it was clearly the case when I was working there in the last few years, there was then the Budget Control Act. And at that time, we had caps on discretionary spending for defense and non-defense. And those caps decided what are pretty, at least in the case of defense, they decided what the guidance was. And for the non-defense agencies, that they were decided on an agency by agency basis so that they added up to the non-defense cap. The big exception always for defense, however, has been something called the emergency supplemental. An emergency I'll put in quotes because the notion originally was that you, in the Department of Defense, it's sort of a joke, if you have a war, that's an emergency, and therefore you need more money than you have in your base budget. Your base budget keeps funding everything sort of at a peacetime level, but if you have war, you have to have additional money to that. And in fact, that's what happened beginning in 2001. We had enormous supplementals. So you would send up a budget at the guidance level, consistent with the BCA, Budget Control Act, and then you would send either simultaneously or later an additional budget, a supplemental budget that might go as high as 100 billion. That process has pretty much continued, even though we're no longer doing what we call then the global war on terror. We're doing it obviously for Ukraine, for Israel. And the question will be, of course, what this president's decision is on Ukraine and how that will impact what we're sending there. So overall, I think guidance for defense will, at the base budget level, be on an upward trend. If you're looking at the supplemental side, it's going to depend on his policy on Ukraine, which could perhaps reduce it, but there's going to, even if that ends, there's going to be a lot of spending, I think, on development needs for that country afterwards.
And if I could just,
Okay,
hey, could I just very quickly, economic assumptions are also going to be a big deal because the new administration is going to want to project, you know, a very healthy economy going on out. Those projections may not come to pass, but I think it is worth it is worth noting that when agencies get the economic assumptions from OMB, and then CBO will come out with its assumptions, it'll be interesting to see how the numbers differ and how rosy the scenarios are. So,
okay, thank you. We're coming towards the end, and I'm just going to first end with a little bit of a commercial. Again, please join AABPA. I put the membership link. It's only $45, and it will put you on the mailing list when we have other events like this. We will continue to offer monthly events. I'd also like to remind everyone what I said at the beginning. We are having the Budget Week in Review starting this Friday. The best place to find out about us is on our LinkedIn page. Join the American Association for Budget and Program Analysis LinkedIn page. So just for and also I'd like to say thank you to our panelists. It really is great to get your perspective. Wish we had more time because there's a lot we could have drilled into. But I'd like to end with just this question, and it's kind of a lightning round. what is the most important thing you would like the audience to take away about the role of OMB and about OMB? And I'll start with Mark.
Yeah, I think, again, the Schedule F is key. The role of OMB to have that neutral competence is absolutely crucial. And I don't think there's a disagreement. It's one of emphasis. If you take a look at the new Schedule F that the president came out with a couple of days ago, they amended the one 2,000 years ago by making this statement. Employees or applicants for these new career policy positions are not required to personally or politically support the current president or the policies of the current administration. They are required to faithfully implement administration policies to the best of their ability, consistent with their constitutional oath and the vesting of executive authority in the president. So it's a matter of emphasis. I don't think any of you all would disagree that our job is not necessarily to personally or politically support the president, but to faithfully implement policies to the best of our ability and our understanding of the law. And it's that last one, understanding of the law, where the gray area is going to exist, and that's where more politicals are going to have to take up the hoe. Thanks.
Courtney?
Everything that Mark said.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, Kathy, do you have any final thoughts?
I believe that OMB is a very important agency, not just because I spent a lot of my life there, I guess because I can't see any better alternative than to having an OMB of some sort. You need a central place within the federal government to pull things together and to bring a quality of analysis and judgment to improve the outcome. If anything, I think I would say that if I were redesigning things, I would make OMB a sort of a broader entity that incorporated some of the work of Treasury, integrate more Treasury and OMB currently together, so that when you are doing a review of the entire budget, you're including tax expenditures, which are a huge part of the budget that I don't think gets enough attention, but obviously costs us resources, the mandatory side and the discretionary side. Whereas now we are spending a very significant part of our time on just the discretionary side. I think it would be better to do a more integrated review and have that done with Treasury more than it is now. But Mark's points are, I agree with Mark and Courtney that this institution has played a very important role, and I hope that it continues in them, and the notion of neutral competence is critical.
Okay, well, that will be the end of, with that, thank you again. I thank you so much. It's, this will be the end. Andy Ryder, can you stop recording? I'm willing to stick around for